Joining us now in the studio, Congressman Michael Guest. He represents Mississippi's 3rd District. Good morning, Congressman.
Good morning, Gerard. Good to see you again.
Absolutely. So, of course, we're going to start out with talking to you about your decision to support the 1/6 Independent Commission. I know you and I have talked about it. You've provided your rationale for the decision, but please, sir, provide that to our listeners.
Yeah, and I think it's important for your listeners to know that, my support to establish a 9/11-based commission to look at the events on January 6th. First, it was not a vote against President Trump, nor was it a vote against the Republican Party. I believe that the establishment of a commission, again, based upon what we did after 9/11, an equally divided commission between Republicans and Democrats, is the best way for us to be able to get to the truth and determine and get answers to questions that we still don't have now 5 months after the fact. Some of the things that I would like to know, and I think many Americans would like to know, is, there were things such as the explosive devices that were found outside the Republican and the Democratic Party headquarters. We know that those devices were either going to be used to attempt to kill legislators or create a diversion. And the narrative of the media has been that what happened on the 6th was a spontaneous event, that because of the rally that Trump held, that he encouraged people to go to the Capitol and storm the Capitol, but they overlooked things such as the planning and the timing it would have taken to assemble explosive devices, to plant those outside of both Republican and Democratic Party headquarters, which clearly cuts against the narrative that the media is trying to portray. We also don't hear about what groups such as Antifa and other non-government groups played on that day. We know that looking at the riots that occurred last summer, that what began in many cities as peaceful protests, those protests were often hijacked. They then led to rioting, to looting, to destruction. I believe that some of those same groups also played a role in what happened there at the United States Capitol. And I think it's important for us and the American people for us to get real answers as to what did the FBI know, what did our federal law enforcement know leading up to the 6th, what information did they share with the Capitol Police, and if the Capitol Police had knowledge about what was going to occur and had actionable intelligence, why weren't we better prepared on the 6th? What information had they shared with Speaker Nancy Pelosi? Did Pelosi have any decision-making in the fact that we weren't properly prepared for the crowds that we saw that day? What role did she play in not having the National Guard on standby if their presence was needed? And I believe the only way we're going to find answers to those and other questions is a equally divided, nonpartisan 9/11-based commission. We're not going to find that by investigations being conducted by the Oversight Committee or the Judiciary Committee in the House. Those are democratically led committees. If you look at Oversight, you've got Rashida Tlaib and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. They're not going to dive down and find and answer these difficult questions. If you look at Judiciary, it's led by Jerry Nadler, who was a close ally of Nancy Pelosi. And so for us to find these answers, we're going to have a committee that is based upon a nonpartisan committee that does not have politicians, that are going to have experts appointed. And I felt like that this was the best chance, Gerard, that we were going to have to be able to answer these questions and then to move forward, because these investigations are going to continue, whether they're done by a nonpartisan commission, whether they're done by Judiciary, whether Speaker Pelosi appoints a select committee made up strictly of partisan hacks that will have subpoena power. And so to me, this was the best way to get this issue behind us as Republicans, so that we're not going to be continuing to deal with this and answer questions next November and then 4 years from now, when we're moving into a presidential election. We've got to make sure that we have put this behind us, that we can say as Republicans that we have looked into what has happened, we have gotten all the answers, and that we can then begin focusing on the policies that we're seeing that are coming out of the Biden administration, not looking back at the events of January 6th of 2021.
So I think one of the challenges is, if I could just kind of summarize and ask you to react, this you felt was a better alternative and a better approach to the the others. I mean, when I hear about Nadler running an investigation, or I don't know, or even the DOJ, which is of course under the control and the management of the president and his cabinet, I get concerned about that as well. And so, because they don't want this to die. The Democrats do not want this to die, as far as I can tell. I believe they see it as in their political best interest to keep this discussion going. And more importantly, they want to hang this on Donald Trump desperately. They want to get to some conclusion that says it's 100% the result of incitement by Donald Trump.
Yeah, and I agree completely with that. Looking at all the options as to who is going to investigate what happened on January the 6th. Do you trust a committee led by Jerry Nadler? Do you trust a committee upon which Rashida Tlaib and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez sits? Do you trust the Department of Justice? We saw, based on the Russia collusion investigation, which was led by Peter Schrock, clearly he had an agenda, and his agenda was to make Donald Trump look bad and to try to keep Donald Trump from becoming president. And so if we're going to have someone look into the events of January 6th, this commission to me was the best group to conduct such an investigation. Again, based on the commission established after 9/11. There were months of negotiations back and forth between Republicans and Democrats. Originally, when this committee was proposed, it was going to be 11 Democrats and 4 Republicans. And of course, one of the things that we worked so hard for was to see that the committee was equally based, that subpoenas couldn't be issued unless everybody agreed to those subpoenas, that the report would require a majority, so the Democrats couldn't put information in the report that the Republican appointees disagreed with. And the other thing is the committee has to finish up its work by the end of the year, so that this committee is not something that is going to continue the investigation into next spring, into next summer, and try to use this as a way to try to influence the midterm elections of 2022.
And also explain for the benefit of our audience, Congressman, how the appointees are determined, who makes those appointments, and how are they allocated, essentially?
5 Republican appointees and 5 Democrats. And so you have the Republican leaders in the House and Senate. They each get 2. The Democratic leaders in the House and Senate get 2. So Pelosi and Schumer get 2. McCarthy and McConnell get 2. And then the 2 leaders from both sides get together, and then they have a joint appointment. And so, and again, the people that are appointed to this committee are not government officials, so they're not politicians. So you're not going to have members of the House, members of the Senate. These are non-government officials, and if you look at the legislation, it encourages those people who have a background in law enforcement, in prosecution, in intelligence, things that would be very important to really sort through all the information and then to make fact-based findings back to Congress, so that, one, we know what happened on the 6th, and then we can move forward as to what we need to do to make sure that this doesn't happen again.
Yeah, so, all right. You and I think 34 other Republicans, right, in
Correct.
the House supported the I guess was it a resolution or
it was a bill establishing a commission,
okay.
Yes.
I wasn't sure if that required a full-fledged bill or not. It goes over to the Senate and didn't make it.
That's
would
correct.
Require 60 votes in the Senate.
That's right. Would have required 10 Republicans to vote for it. I think that there were 6 or 7 that voted. Some of the members of the Senate had left early. The vote was not held until last Friday, and there were some members of the Senate which had already left Washington, D.C., but it seemed like there were 6 or 7 Republicans on the Senate side that did support the legislation, but because there was not enough votes to break the filibuster and begin debate, the legislation at this point has died.
Yeah. So, all right. So at this point, it's essentially moot. It's dead. So what's going to happen now?
We'll continue to have investigations that will be conducted by House and Senate committees. The Department of Justice is continuing their investigation. And again, we have seen, I have read various news articles that Speaker Pelosi is seriously considering appointing a select committee that she will pick those members, and that those members will then be able to investigate this matter, and they will have subpoena power, and they'll be able to issue reports.
All right. We got a break right here. You can hang around, huh?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, we got Congressman Michael Guest in the studio on the JT Show. We'll be right. Michael Guest in the studio. So, Congressman, a question here This is from Jerry in Waynesboro. He wants to know if you think this was an armed insurrection attempt. Just wants your opinion on that.
You know, I don't believe it was an armed insurrection attempt. I think that there were people who were legitimately concerned about the election. I think that there were individuals that were there in that crowd that were not Republicans who were attempting to egg on and to cause people to act in a manner that they would not normally do. Now, I do think that there are people who need to be criminally prosecuted if you caused destruction, if you stole anything, if there were any acts of violence. Those people should be prosecuted. We should not overlook the fact that what happened that day. And I was at the Capitol. There were millions of people who watched the events that transpired on television. They were reported around the world, and we can't ignore that. We can't try to rewrite history and say, well, what happened on January the 6th was not serious, because I believe it was a very serious event, and I do believe that there needs to be criminal investigations, but I also believe that we need to be able to get to the truth about what really happened that day, and then there needs to be recommendations made to Congress that we can act upon to make sure that these types of events don't happen again, because while this time it may have been members of the Republican Party that did that, next time it could be Antifa, it could be BLM, it could be any number of other groups. And so we've got to be prepared so that when we have people who show up at the Capitol, that we can handle that situation, that they can protest peacefully, that they can petition their government, that their voice can be heard, but we don't have people who are breaching the Capitol and disrupting the proceedings that are going on those days.
Yeah, and so it's a situation where I think some people just feel like the commission might be a waste of time, that just nothing gets accomplished good when you form these commissions up. It sounds, however, interesting to learn about the way those who would comprise the commission are appointed. I mean, that seems fairly fair to me.
Well, and again, if you look at the legislation itself, that the background and the skill set that they want these individuals to have, they want people to have prior experience in law enforcement, in prosecution, in intelligence, in counterintelligence. Those are very important skill sets, and I think that a commission made up of those people versus made up of politicians, because we know if politicians sit on this commission, that the commission is going to accomplish nothing
and be hyper-partisan.
That's right. Yeah. And so if we can pick the right people to serve on that committee, I have at least the hope, and my hope may be misplaced, but I have the hope that they would set aside the party that appointed them, and that they would look for true answers, and that they would put the country before party that appointed them, and that we may actually be able to find answers to questions that are important to the American people.
Yeah. And all right, so we've got lots of you, as you well know, very strong opinions on both sides of this. One question I have, though, concerns whose responsibility is to ensure that the Capitol is safe and protected and not subject to a breach like this. Is it the speakers and the leader on the Senate side? Do they make the calls with respect to calling in law enforcement, National Guard support, any other sort of safety measures like that?
You know, the chief of Capitol Police is going to answer to the speaker, and so the speaker has the ability to hire or fire that individual, and so I believe that a lot of what transpired that day, that Speaker Pelosi has some sort of role to play in that. And again, we have heard reports that the FBI had informed Capitol Police that there were going to be threats against the Capitol on January 6th leading up to that time, and that the Capitol Police, after consulting with Speaker Pelosi, decided not to engage the National Guard, decided not to engage local law enforcement to the point that they would be able to very quickly respond if things began to get out of control. And we know that that's what happened that day, is that the Capitol Police was not prepared for the events that transpired, and that there was an extended delay before we were able to get the proper reinforcements to the Capitol to secure the Capitol and then to begin deliberations again. And so I truly believe that if you're looking at an investigation, that a key part of that investigation needs to be surrounding Speaker Pelosi. What was Speaker Pelosi's role, and what, by her being involved and being part of those discussions, what is ultimately the blame that should be placed on her for what happened on January the 6th?
So I think what we hear from a lot of folks is, Congressman, is that with respect to this investigation, maybe there's some justification for an investigation of some sort into what happened. But there are a lot of folks that are somewhat outraged that there's not a similar calling for one over the death of Ashley Babbitt in the Capitol. And then, of course, the stream of riots that took place last year across the country. What sort of authority does the Congress have in that respect to, I guess, commission some sort of investigation into those events?
Well, as it relates to the commission on January 6th, part of that would include the death of the young lady who was killed there in the Capitol. That was part of the events that transpired on that day. Okay. The commission also has the ability to expand their investigation outside of the events of January 6th and the days leading up to January the 6th. I have called for, as well as other members of Congress, have asked that we continue to look into what happened last summer. I think we still see a lot of rage out there. Yeah. Matter of fact, we sponsored a resolution condemning the riots that occurred shortly after those events transpired, because I thought it was important that we as elected officials stand up and say, hey, we cannot allow these types of events to happen. Because you are upset, a certain group is upset about something that happened, you have the right to peacefully protest. You have the right to assemble, but you don't have the right to then where those protests turn into rioting and looting and destruction and violence. Yeah. And that's what we saw in many of our cities last summer. And so, I think that those need to be looked at, but I think that the commission that I voted to establish needs to be focused on January 6th. If we hope to accomplish this and put this investigation to rest between now and the end of the year, you can't include the events that transpired last summer. We've got to be narrowly focused so that they can conduct their investigation, they can issue the report, and this can be concluded by the end of the year. If you start focusing on what happened in our major cities last year, you're going to see an investigation that may never end.
Well, I guess the question is it possible that the Congress could call for such an investigation into what happened across America's cities? And heck, as you know, it's happening, still happening in some of them. Dead-gum, the violent crime statistics in some of these cities, Portland, Oregon, for example, up 800%, the murder rate is. Is there some action the Congress can take with respect to that? Could they summon a mayor, for example, or a police chief to the Capitol to ask, hey, what's going on here?
Yeah, I mean, you currently have that ability under the current committee structure that we have in place now, but you could also appoint a special committee. Okay. And so that could be a select committee appointed by the Speaker. Since the Speaker Pelosi is in charge of Congress, she could appoint a committee directly, or Congress could pass legislation to look into the events that transpired last summer and to make recommendations to Congress as to what we can do to better be prepared if the events like that were to transpire in the future. And also, again, to help us get a clear picture of the groups that were instigating that violence, instigating that situation last summer, because in many instances, as we just talked about, you had peaceful protests, which later, with small groups of people, as we saw the night go on, generally the protests would begin in the day. As we got under the cover of darkness, that's when you would see the looting, that's when you would see the rioting, that's when you would see the acts of violence.
But this is still something that would require, if you did it through an act, would require, obviously, you'd have to pass both houses.
That's right.
Through similar means. Yeah. Not likely to happen with Democrats controlling both chambers, essentially.
It would never pass the House of Representatives today. As long as the Democrats control that, and as long as Speaker Pelosi is the Speaker, we won't even get a vote on that. Legislation can be introduced, but that will never make it out of committee and would never make it to the House floor for a vote, because, again, that's not what the Democrats are pushing. They want to continue to remain focused on January the 6th.
Yeah. You got to go? You want to hang for another segment?
I got one more.
All right. We got Congressman Michael Guest in the studio. Got a couple more questions for you. I want to talk to you about the Stars and Stripe Act as well when we come back. Stay with us. We're just in the studio. So Congressman, a lot of folks obviously have a lot of frustration about things they see going on. The situation with Ashley Babbitt, we've got one of the insurgents that I believe is still held in custody, and we can't seem to get any information about that. We've got the riots across the country, and people just feel like, well, those issues warrant investigation as well, but you don't have any power, essentially. Explain that to them.
Particularly as it relates to the House of Representatives, the majority party controls. The majority party sets the rules. The majority party has the chairmanship and the authority on all of the committees. And so short of a discharge petition, which is a very difficult process and will require Democratic buy-in, it's impossible for Republicans to get legislation to the floor without having the Speaker's approval. And whether it be Republicans or Democrats, whatever party is in the majority controls the agenda in the House of Representatives. Very different than the Senate, where we've talked about, you've got to have 60 votes, the filibuster rule, which really have some protections for the minority. Those protections don't exist in the House of Representatives. And so I understand people's frustration. I talk to people every day, hey, why can't you do something about that? And as hard as we try, we can introduce legislation all day long, but to get that legislation through committee and onto the House floor is going to require Democratic buy-in. And we don't have that at that point. And Speaker Pelosi has done a very good job of keeping the folks within her party from working with Republicans. We introduced the resolution during Law Enforcement Week, which was about 2 weeks ago. And that legislation wasn't anything other than just honoring law enforcement for the job that they do every day and recognizing those individuals who had passed away during their line of duty, including those that died of COVID-related deaths this year. We shopped that resolution around to every member of the Democratic Party, and we had one member who would agree to co-sponsor a resolution supporting law enforcement. Val Demings of Florida, who was a former police chief, was the only Democrat who would sign off on a resolution, a non-binding resolution honoring law enforcement. And so that tells you how difficult it is in this environment for Republicans and Democrats to work together for us to have any bipartisanship on any issue, whether that be infrastructure, which is something that we're seeing a broad topic on. We've recently seen the budget that the president has introduced has record deficits, going to have record high taxes. We see now that the Democrats are once again becoming the tax and spend party. And so it is difficult with Republicans being in the majority for us, particularly in the House, to have influence on major pieces of legislation.
So let's just be clear for the record, though, Congressman, the issue with Ashley Babbitt, her tragic death, the person held in custody that we can't seem to get any info about, the insurrection in our cities and the riots that occurred, these things are of concern to you, and you would support investigations into them. You just can't get any traction because you don't have the numbers, essentially.
That's right. Most assuredly, it would seem to me that one of the committees I serve on, Homeland Security, that we would be having routine hearings on what happened on January the 6th. We've not held a single hearing on that. And that is, again, because we're not in the majority. We don't have that sort of control as being able to force the agenda. The Democrats are driving the agenda, whether it be on the committee level, whether it be on the floor level, and all of that is flowing from the Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi.
And the best thing we could do is flip it in 2022.
That's right. If we were able to retake the majority, then we would be able to drive what legislation we're bringing to the floor. We would be able to drive what the committees are investigating, and we would be able to completely change the narrative that we have today.
All right. Please tell us about the Stars and Stripes Act. This is probably something not a lot of people know about, and it disturbed me when I found out about it.
We saw last week that President Biden had said that he was going to allow BLM flags to be flown over the United States Embassy. And as we read that, we began to talk to some of our other Republican members. Nicole Maliotakis from New York, her office is actually right across the hall from mine. She introduced legislation which we co-sponsored, which would ban politically motivated symbols or flags to be flown over our United States Embassy. Really, it strictly would allow the Stars and Stripes to be flown, and then if there were some other flags, as maybe of some governmental entities, such as the flag of the United States Army, United States Air Force, but BLM is a partisan political movement, and if you look at their website, things that they promote are convicting and banning President Trump from holding office. They promote expelling Republicans from Congress who voted not to certify the election.
Yep.
They support defunding the police. So when you have an organization like BLM who is so politically motivated, so far to the left, and we're allowing their flag to be flown over our embassies across the world, that is wrong and improper.
I heard that one of them somewhere, we got just a couple seconds here, was bigger than the American flag.
No doubt.
Yeah. That's just crazy. Appreciate
yes,
your support of that.
Thank you for having me on. Let me stay along for the ride.
You bet. We'll talk to you soon. Thanks for coming on, Congressman.
Yes, sir. Thank you.
We'll be right back.